Today on CityCast Boise, biblically responsible investing might sound harmless, just another way for people to align their money with their morals. But one Meridian investment firm is using its billions in assets to pressure major corporations on LGBTQ inclusion and abortion access. Is this faith-based finance or Christian nationalism in a suit? It's Monday, August 11th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Sarah Cutler from the Idaho Statesman is here to tell me more about the biblically responsible investing trend and what it looks like in the Treasure Valley. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we dive into this conversation, I have a favor to ask all of the listeners and a chance for someone to win $250. CityCast Boise is doing our annual listener survey, and it would really help us out if you took it. If you took it last year, big thanks. And we would be so grateful if you took it again so we can get the most up-to-date perspectives from our listeners. To take the survey, please go to citycast.fm/survey. It only takes a few minutes, and when you take it, you'll be eligible to win a $250 Visa gift card and CityCast Boise swag. Go to citycast.fm/survey. Now, Sarah, this Meridian-based firm is offering to help customers invest their money in a, quote, biblically responsible way. What exactly does that mean, and what values are they using to make their assessments on what's biblically responsible?
Yeah, so basically this is a firm that, their perspective is for a long time, people, including Christians, have just invested in the things that would make them the most money and haven't really paid attention to the values of those firms or what types of things they might be, supporting or producing. So this firm, tries to use what it sees as biblical values, for example, from their perspective, that marriage is between a man and a woman, or that life begins at conception, to influence, which companies it does recommend investing in and which it does not. So they look at both companies' kind of negatives and positives. A negative might be a company that is involved in some way in pornography or producing abortion drugs or even abortion activism. And a positive could be something like environmental stewardship or even something that almost is as mundane as, treating employees well. So they kind of weigh both the negatives and positives of companies and come up with a score for them on a spectrum, I guess, of biblically responsible or not.
So this company is called Inspire, and it's currently based in Idaho, specifically in Meridian. What does the founder say about his choice to build this kind of business here? Like, why did he want it based in Idaho?
Well, actually, the founder and the company started in Southern California. And the founder mentioned that he and I think it was only 3 or 4 fellow members of the company, it used to be smaller, moved wholesale to Meridian a couple years back. And he didn't really provide a specific reason why. He said that, they had always kind of planned to move out of California and found themselves in Idaho and felt that it was a very welcoming place. And he did say they've received a very warm welcome here, but I don't know if they knew in advance that would happen.
Okay. And given how many interpretations of the Bible exist, how does Inspire defend its very specific conservative reading as this moral benchmark for investing?
Basically, it's based on their read of the Bible. And they were clear that both in terms of their employees and in terms of the people who invest with them, it's people across different Christian denominations. But they were pretty clear that it is a conservative reading of Christian texts. So their kind of division was, you could be Baptist, Protestant, Catholic, if you are sort of bought in with these, for example, the idea that life begins at conception, whereas a church that, to use the CEO's words, a church that flies a pride flag or a rainbow flag in June, probably wouldn't be someone who would want to invest in this firm. So they were pretty clear that they're a kind of orthodox, traditional reading, conservative reading, but they felt that it applied to conservative Christians of all different backgrounds.
Now, when I read your article, you said that Inspire screens for things like abortion or abortion access, but it also rewards environmental sustainability. How do they reconcile that with the broader conservative pushback on environmental policy? I was really surprised to see that would be a positive for them.
I actually asked about that particularly, and I believe that the CEO referred me to a passage from Genesis that says, that humans are meant to, I believe it was like work and keep the earth, something like that. And it was an idea. So from his perspective, from the company's perspective, taking care of the earth is a Christian value. Now, he did, I think, say in his response to me that they may view that differently than traditional environmentalists or folks more on the left, that maybe they see kind of a balance between, yes, we want to protect the earth, but we are also the stewards, and it's not a bad thing to extract from the earth as well. So maybe what that looks like in terms of environmental policy may look different, but he did express that from his perspective, it is a Christian value to care for the environment.
And Sarah, all of this sounds really similar to when people are trying to invest using environmental, social, and governance, or ESG criteria. I mean, it really sounds like this is a conservative Christian version of that.
I think that's a fair characterization. And it was interesting, I learned during my research that earlier in its life, this company actually branded itself that way as biblical ESG, I believe they phrased it. And, the founder's hope was that he could create what he called like a two-party system in the ESG world. From his perspective, many of the ESG evaluation firms, people who look at this, were coming from a more left-leaning bent. And he was on board with the idea of investing according to values, but wanted to be like a voice for more conservative values. What he found from his telling was that he got kind of laughed out of the room, was not welcome in these spaces. And so in response to that, the company basically stopped using that term and kind of separated itself. But I think they would agree that they are doing something similar, maybe from a different set of values.
And Idaho lawmakers have pushed back pretty hard on ESG investing. Have they had the same level of scrutiny for this conservative Christian biblical ESG?
To some extent, I will say that lawmakers I reached out to weren't familiar with this company, or maybe hadn't even heard of the idea of biblically responsible investing. When we spoke about it, they seemed sort of enthusiastic in the abstract. But what I did find really interesting is I think a lot of the opposition from Idaho lawmakers against ESG was less about the idea of people investing along those lines and more about the idea that they would be that disclosing those kinds of things would be mandatory for a company, or that state funds would be invested along those lines. The sentiment I kept hearing is people should invest however they want to invest, but it's not government's place to tell people how, that they have what set of values they should be using. So I thought that was an interesting nuance that I hadn't realized at the outset.
Got any fun trips coming up? One thing you probably haven't put on your packing list is learning the language. But with Babbel, you can start talking in just a few weeks. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I've been learning Spanish with Babbel. And I also just persuaded my friend who's going to France this fall to learn French with Babbel, but that is another story. Babbel is extremely fun and intuitive. It's like having a private tutor in your pocket. Handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel's lessons are voiced by real native speakers and built with science-backed cognitive tools and interactive features to fit any learning style. I love a lot of the different Babbel features. The Babbel games for sentence building, Babbel's speech recognition, which helps me get the pronunciation right. And now I'm really into Babbel's word of the day, which greets me on the homepage of the app. Every day, a new word revealed like a little surprise with a sentence to help contextualize it. It's like a daily treat for me. Studies from Yale, Michigan State, and other leading universities continue to prove that Babbel works. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Look, I want you to learn another language. So I'm teaming up with Babbel to gift you 55% off subscriptions, but only for CityCast listeners at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 55% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
You found that Inspire Investing was actually censured by the SEC for, quote, misleading investors. Can you tell us more about what happened and what was Inspire's reaction to that violation, or how did they explain it?
Yeah, that was something we learned about later on in our reporting. Basically, my impression is that Inspire, along with a range of values-based investment firms, including ESG, folks more on the left, were all sort of scrutinized at the same time by the SEC. I believe the CEO said that was starting in 2022, so like a multi-year process. And I think it was probably part of an effort to kind of standardize what these firms are offering and make sure people are delivering on what they're promising. And the SEC found that in the case of Inspire, that there were some problems, not with its overall approach, but with kind of the strictness with which it was adhering to what it was promising. So it was promising customers that it had a very rigorous, methodology, but in fact, maybe it was more manual and it was missing things, for example, or it didn't have a strict policy on how to define how bad or how good some of the, biblically responsible or irresponsible things might be. And when I spoke to the company about it, they actually seemed like they were pretty receptive. It sounds like they had actually identified some of these issues and maybe corrected them before the SEC's verdict kind of came out. They also, I would say, maybe downplayed the seriousness of this. As a layperson, as I told the CEO, $300,000 sounds like a pretty big fine, but they said that some of the other companies investigated at the same time as they were hit with much heavier fines for more serious violations. So from their perspective, they were they kept saying that they welcomed the interaction with the SEC and it helped them, that they want to grow and improve, and it helped them do that. So that was kind of their framing on the whole thing.
And Inspire has given negative scores to top performing companies like Amazon and Apple. Doesn't limiting investment in major corporations like this put their clients' financial returns at risk? I mean, how do they square that with their fiduciary responsibility to their clients?
I would say, at least in terms of how Inspire markets itself, their argument is that you don't have to take a financial hit to be investing in biblically responsible firms. So at least they make the case that their customers will not suffer for that. I don't have a direct answer to your question about, what does it mean if you can't invest in Apple or Amazon? I will say you make a similar point that Idaho's treasurer, Julie Ellsworth, made in some of her earlier criticisms of ESG. And again, when I reached out to her, that she said from her perspective, the point of managing someone's investment is to maximize their profit. And it's not acceptable or it's wrong to have some other goals floating around unless you've kind of pre-agreed on that. Obviously, someone who works with a company like this, that is something they're seeking out. But I think that was part of her opposition to the state kind of imposing this on anyone. So that, she made a similar point, I guess.
Inspire has over $3 billion in assets, and they're growing pretty rapidly. So how much influence does Inspire have on shifting corporate policies? I mean, we've seen a lot of that with the Trump administration, but with that much money in assets, how much pull do they have in wanting these companies to be, quote, biblically responsible?
My sense is that they have had some success in changing companies' approach. So something that the CEO mentioned to me is that they don't want to just invest or not invest in a company, but they actually go out of their way to, when they find what they consider to be a problematic practice from a company, they actually try to engage with that company and see if they can persuade them to, change their approach. And so they have, for example, been involved in, I believe, a lawsuit against Target. Target, had previously had a large Pride display during Pride Month of, rainbow products and clothing. And the company I think maybe still is involved in a lawsuit against them, basically arguing that Target misled its investors about how much of a business risk that was going to be to kind of get involved in this political space. I don't know what effect that particular piece has had, but in general, they do try to be pretty active and engaged. It may be a bit of like a time will tell about how much, which companies are susceptible to this influence, which just stay the course. But certainly that's something this company is trying to do.
Yeah. In your piece, you specifically brought up that Target example. And then you quoted Inspire saying, they're not trying to force their values on others, but they did admit that they're actively pressuring companies to shift their stances on LGBTQ rights, abortion access, social activism, et cetera. So isn't that exactly what their values-based investing does?
I think that the CEO's perspective is that it's not that in this example that they're trying to shift a company from being, supportive of gay rights to in opposition to gay rights. They want to push companies back towards like the neutral. That's what they publicly say in any case, that they just don't feel it's a company's place to be taking a stance on social issues. So I think one of the comparisons that the CEO made is that he doesn't think it's appropriate for company trainings to promote tolerance or celebration of gay marriage, for example, as a form of inclusion. By the same token, he would not find it appropriate for a company training to say, hey, marriage is between a man and a woman. So it was kind of interesting. Like, to your point, they are very much out in the world and promoting their interpretation of Christian values. And at the same time, they're not necessarily trying to get everyone to agree with them, but they kind of just want those things to stay out of the corporate sphere. So Yeah, it's kind of an interesting line that they're towing.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to ask you about this stance they take where, yeah, they use the word neutrality for these companies, but I'm curious how they reconcile that when in practice, they are pushing very specific religious and political agendas like anti-abortion or not having access to abortion, or like you brought up with an LGBTQ inclusion training. I think it's very different when you're talking about a group who has only had legal access to marriage since 2015 versus a hetero marriage that has been legal for years and years and years. So do they truly view what they're viewing as neutrality, or did you get the sense that they do admit that they are pushing their specific religious and political agenda, but that feels like neutrality to them?
I think they really, I get the sense that they genuinely view these as sort of equal and opposite forces, I guess, and that they just want people to be in the middle. But one person that we quoted, not directly, but through another article that had covered this company and others like it, made a version of that point, which was that, it's not really fair to equate celebration of gay rights or protection of gay rights with, groups that have been in the majority forever and haven't really faced any discrimination. That, if it's, the line, I guess, between people who are sort of fighting to reach equivalence and equality with others is not the same thing. So I think, that group's perspective certainly was that members of the LGBTQ community very much suffer from this perspective, this idea that to advocate for their rights is somehow a stray away from the neutral. They feel, we're just trying to get back to neutral. That's all we ever wanted. So I think that's a really good question. But I do think that this company believes that it is, seeking neutrality and doesn't want anyone to get special treatment.
Yeah. And I used to be Mormon. I used to be pretty far right in my politics. And from that perspective, yeah, kind of anything even brought up about LGBTQ or abortion did feel like a political attack or like an attack on my values. But with my shift in my perspective, what I used to view as neutrality was very clearly conservative Christian values being perpetuated in the public sphere versus a neutrality of an actual neutrality, which is everyone, their ideas, their perspectives, their values have space in that market. So I'm always a little leery when people talk about neutrality, but that neutrality involves LGBTQ people not having representation or abortion access being diminished. So I'm really curious your thoughts on this. Is this approach to investing maybe a new frontier for Christian nationalism by using money to enforce their social values through investing?
I don't know if I can comment on where Christian nationalism fits into this, but I can say that, the CEO himself was very clear that, I think he used the phrase asleep at the wheel, that for a long time Christians have maybe espoused certain values at church, but the way that they were investing did not reflect those values. And so his whole, I guess, reason for being, or the company's reason for being, was to try to mobilize, the things that people may say and believe when they're worshiping and bring that into like the real world of, actually affecting change, pushing companies, using that financial weight to push companies to espouse the values that you believe in.
Sarah, what do you think that this rise of biblically responsible investing says about where we are right now as a state, or maybe even more broadly as a country?
I guess I can say that looking at stories about the kind of intersection of religion and politics, have spoken to people at a variety of churches and, often of Christian backgrounds, but again, running the gamut. And I do feel that some of the things the CEO said reflect other things that have come up in those conversations. This same idea I mentioned about not wanting to be asleep at the wheel, but wanting Christians to bring their values into the public sphere, whether that's into the Capitol, whether that's to be more aggressively lobbying lawmakers, whether that's in this case to be making sure that their investments align with their values. I feel like that's a theme that's come up a lot, is this sense of we don't want to be on the sidelines. Now is a moment, whether that's in Idaho or our country, I can't say, but now is a moment for Christians to kind of wake up and become more involved than they have been. So I certainly can't say how widespread that sentiment is, but it is something that's come up in a lot of my conversations with people here.
Is there anything else from your reporting on this story or investigating this story that didn't make it into the piece, but you thought was really interesting, or you're still chewing on it a little bit? Anything that listeners should know about?
Maybe parts of this made it into the story, but I was struck by how similar this is to ESG, even to the level of, I would imagine, a lot of the things that ESG curricula, for lack of a better word, look at are the same, actually, to your point about environmental stewardship. So it's interesting how similar these are. And it did make me wonder if ESG kind of opened a Pandora's box, I guess. Once you open the door of the idea of investing based on values, it made me wonder if something like this company was inevitable, that somebody was going to say, I like this idea, but hey, these aren't my values. And, that this was sort of a natural evolution. So I guess that's something I've still been thinking about, this kind of like equal and opposite reaction.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. I thought this was a really fascinating story about a topic I really didn't know anything about, didn't know was happening in the Treasure Valley. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on our show and dive a little deeper into it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, that's a great reason to become a CityCast Boise neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with everything you need to know about the Caldwell Night Rodeo. Catch you then.